I get tips from people as to where there might be something hiding, and then sometimes I'll just take a day and just go searching.
For 9 years, Danny the Count Koker was one of the most recognizable faces on cable television. Every week, millions of viewers watched him haggle over rusted Mustangs, argue with his crew about paint jobs, and turn forgotten scrap metal into rolling works of art. Then, without warning, the cameras stopped. No finale. No farewell episode. No press release explaining why. Counting Cars simply disappeared from the schedule, and Danny Koker went quiet along with it. In the years since, rumors have filled that silence. Stories about lawsuits, arrests, illness, and betrayal, some of them wildly exaggerated, others rooted in something real. So what actually happened to the man behind the bandana once the cameras went dark? Let's separate what's true from what the internet made up. If you were a regular viewer of Counting Cars in the spring of 2021, you probably don't remember the exact episode that turned out to be the last one. That's because nobody was told it was the last one. There was no clip show retrospective, no on-camera goodbye, no title card thanking the fans for a decade of watching Danny and his crew rebuild classic iron. New episodes simply stopped showing up on the History Channel schedule, and the show quietly slipped into rerun purgatory. At first, fans assumed it was a temporary gap. Television production everywhere had been thrown into chaos by the pandemic, and plenty of long-running shows took extended breaks while networks figured out how to film safely again. But as months turned into a year, and a year turned into 2, it became clear that nobody at History was planning to bring the cameras back to Count's Kustoms. There was never an official cancellation notice. There was just an absence, and absences tend to get filled with speculation. The most boring explanation is also the most likely one. Reality shows about restoring and building custom vehicles are expensive to produce. Every episode requires sourcing a rare car, paying a crew of skilled fabricators and painters, and often spending tens of thousands of dollars on parts before a single scene is filmed. Counting Cars had already run for 10 seasons and more than 180 episodes by the time it went dark, a remarkably long life for any reality series. Viewership, which had once made the show one of history's flagship programs, had cooled away ratings for almost every long-running unscripted series eventually do. Add in a global pandemic that made travel, car hunting road trips, and in-person filming genuinely difficult, and you have all the ingredients for a show quietly fading out rather than going out with a bang. There's also a simpler, more human factor that rarely makes the headlines. Running a real, working auto shop and filming a television show at the same time is exhausting. Danny wasn't playing a character. Count's Kustoms was, and still is, an actual business with actual customers and actual deadlines, and trying to keep that operation running smoothly while a camera crew documented every decision for a decade takes a toll that doesn't show up in a ratings report. None of that made for a satisfying story, though, and the internet doesn't like unsatisfying stories. So while History Channel executives were quietly moving on to other programming, a very different narrative was building online. One involving fraud, secrets, and a version of Danny Koker that had almost nothing to do with the real one. To understand how Danny Koker built something worth writing rumors about in the first place, you have to go back decades before Pawn Stars ever knew his name. He was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1964, into a family that ran on 2 very different kinds of engines. His father and other relatives worked for Ford Motor Company, the kind of men who could diagnose an engine problem by ear. At the same time, the Koker family was deeply rooted in gospel and Southern music, and young Danny spent much of his childhood traveling and performing with a family singing group, learning piano well enough that by his early teens he could move comfortably between hymns and boogie-woogie. That dual upbringing shaped him in a way that's easy to overlook when you only know him as a car guy. Long before he was known for classic Mopars and rare Cobras, Danny Koker was a working musician, someone who understood showmanship, stage presence, and how to hold an audience's attention. When he eventually moved to Las Vegas as a young man, those instincts translated directly into local television. He landed a gig hosting a late-night horror movie program on a station connected to his family, creating a campy, cape-wearing on-air persona that gave him his first real taste of local fame and, not coincidentally, gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his career. Vegas is where the 2 halves of his life finally merged. In the late 1990s, he opened Count's Kustoms, a small restoration and custom-build shop that started out doing exactly what small shops do: fixing whatever rolled through the door and slowly building a reputation on quality work. Around the same time, he leaned back into music, eventually fronting a rock band and opening a bar built around his love of classic rock and horror movie kitsch. By the mid-2000s, Danny Koker was a genuine local celebrity in Las Vegas. The guy who could rebuild your carburetor in the afternoon and play piano at his own bar that night. Outside the city, though, almost nobody had heard of him. That changed because of a car and a television crew that happened to be filming a few blocks away. Pawn Stars needed someone who actually knew what a rare car was worth, someone who could look at a beat-up classic and explain, in plain language, exactly why it was valuable or exactly why it wasn't. Producers were pointed toward Kustoms, and Danny's first appearances on the show made an immediate impression. He wasn't reciting facts like a textbook. He was talking the way a mechanic talks to another mechanic, and audiences responded to that authenticity. He became a recurring face on the series, appearing more than 20 times between 2010 and 2013, and every time he showed up, the History Channel noticed a bump in engagement. That kind of repeated, organic popularity is exactly what television executives dream about, and it wasn't long before History decided Danny didn't need to be a supporting character in someone else's pawn shop. He needed his own show. Counting Cars premiered in August 2012, built around the real, everyday chaos of Kustoms, hunting down rare vehicles, negotiating with stubborn sellers, and turning rust buckets into showpieces, all while managing a crew of strong personalities who didn't always get along. What made the show work wasn't really the cars, even though the cars were spectacular. It was the shop floor dynamic. Longtime painter Ryan Evans, known for candy apple finishes so deep they looked wet even after they'd cured. Right-hand man Kevin Mack, who could fabricate a custom bracket out of raw scrap metal faster than most shops could order the part. A colorful rotating cast of mechanics and fabricators who bickered, argued, and occasionally threw things at each other, then somehow pulled together to finish an impossible build on deadline. Viewers weren't just watching a restoration. They were watching a workplace, one that felt unusually real for a genre that often leans heavily on scripted feeling drama. Over 10 seasons, the show delivered plenty of standout moments. Rare muscle cars tracked down in barns and backlots, tense negotiations with sellers who didn't know what they were sitting on, and ambitious, expensive restorations that pushed the shop to its limits. Some builds became fan favorites specifically because of how much could go wrong along the way. A promising restoration would stall out when a supposedly complete engine turned out to be missing half its internals. A rare parts hunt would end with Danny standing in someone's barn, doing mental math on whether a car was worth what the owner thought it was worth. A finished build would roll out of the shop looking flawless on camera, while everyone who worked on it knew exactly how many late nights and blown deadlines it took to get there. That tension between the finished product and the mess required to get there was the real engine of the show, arguably more than any single car that ever came through the door. The crew dynamic gave the series its texture in a way a purely car-focused format never could have. Ryan Evans brought 2 decades of paint experience and a perfectionist streak that occasionally put him at odds with anyone who touched a panel before it was ready. Kevin Mack handled fabrication with a quiet intensity, the kind of craftsman who let the work speak for him and rarely needed more than a few words to explain a problem or its solution. Other regulars rotated in and out over the years, each bringing their own specialty and their own friction to a shop that ran less like a corporate workplace and more like an extended, occasionally dysfunctional family. Viewers weren't watching actors deliver lines about teamwork. They were watching people who actually had to finish the build together, whether they were speaking to each other that week or not, and that authenticity is a big part of why the show lasted as long as it did. Danny sat in the middle of all of it, not just as the owner but as the person who had to balance the creative instincts of his crew against the practical demands of running a business, all while a camera crew documented every decision. That balancing act is easy to underestimate from the outside. Keeping a shop full of strong, opinionated craftsmen pointed in the same direction, on schedule, on budget, while also being the face of a national television show, is its own kind of full-time job layered on top of an already full-time job. It's worth remembering that context, because it's exactly the kind of pressure that makes it easier to hand off responsibilities like bookkeeping to someone else entirely, and to trust that person completely simply because there isn't time or bandwidth to double-check every number. That's not a flaw unique to Danny Koker. It's a common blind spot for busy business owners everywhere, and it's precisely the blind spot that would eventually cause real problems behind the scenes at Kustoms. Running a business that's also a television set creates a strange kind of exposure. Every deal Kustoms made was, at least partially, public. But the parts of the business that never made it onto camera, the bookkeeping, the contracts, the back-office decisions, were exactly where real problems eventually surfaced. The first serious legal trouble arrived in 2014, when a couple who had paid Counts Kustoms roughly $50,000 for a Mustang restoration filed a lawsuit claiming the project was never finished and their money was never returned. It was the kind of dispute that happens in the restoration business more often than customers realize. A project balloons in scope, costs spiral, and somewhere in the middle a customer feels like they've been left in the dark. The case became public record, but there's no widely reported outcome showing a verdict or settlement, which is itself common in civil disputes that get resolved privately. The more serious issue came from inside the shop itself. Joseph Frontiera had been brought on in the early 2010s to help manage the business side of Counts Kustoms, the unglamorous but essential work of tracking expenses and keeping the company's finances in order. He never appeared on camera, and most fans of the show had no idea he existed. That anonymity was, in hindsight, part of the problem. Nobody was watching the books the way the cameras were watching the cars. In 2017, Counts Kustoms filed a lawsuit accusing Frontiera of misusing roughly $75,000 in company funds, alleging the money had gone toward personal expenses, including payments tied to his own vehicle and airline travel that had nothing to do with the business. The lawsuit also claimed his handling of the company's taxes had been so mismanaged that the business was hit with an IRS penalty in the tens of thousands of dollars. The filing further alleged that the staffing agency that had placed Frontiera in the role failed to disclose that he had a prior history involving similar financial misconduct with an earlier employer, a detail that, if true, made the situation feel less like an isolated lapse and more like a pattern nobody at the shop had caught in time. The case dragged on for a couple of years, with the staffing agency countersuing and pointing blame back at Counts Kustoms over how the hiring arrangement had been structured. By most available accounts, the dispute was eventually resolved through the courts without ever producing the kind of dramatic, headline-grabbing conviction that internet rumors later claimed. What's clear is that the discovery of financial mismanagement happening quietly behind the scenes, while the show up front was telling a story about trust, family, and hard work, left a mark on how Danny approached the business afterward. Trusting a bookkeeper with unsupervised access to company accounts is the kind of arrangement most owners don't think twice about until something goes wrong. Once it does, it tends to change how a person runs everything else. Here's where the story tends to get warped, because once counting cars went off the air with no explanation and there was a real, documented lawsuit involving embezzlement sitting in the public record, the internet did what the internet does. It filled in the blanks with the most dramatic version available. Some corners of the web ran with claims that Danny himself had been arrested for fraud. Others insisted he'd been secretly indicted, or that federal agents had raided his properties. Entertainment aggregator sites, the kind that recycle each other's headlines without much fact-checking, spun stories claiming he was seriously ill, or that he'd quietly died, or that he'd resurfaced hawking sketchy CBD products on daytime television. None of it held up to scrutiny. There is no verified record of Danny Koker facing criminal charges, no credible reporting confirming an arrest, and the death and illness rumors were debunked as quickly as they appeared, largely because Danny kept showing up in public, on stage with his band and at car events, looking very much alive and very much not in prison. It's easy to see how the confusion happened. The real embezzlement case involved Counts Kustoms as a company and a former employee who never appeared on the show. But headlines don't always make that distinction clear, and once a phrase like "counting cars embezzlement scandal" starts circulating without context, it's a short jump for casual readers to assume the scandal involves the star of the show rather than a bookkeeper working quietly in a back office. Danny largely avoided commenting on the swirl of rumors in real time, which is a common piece of legal advice for anyone involved in an active or recently settled lawsuit, but silence online tends to be read as confirmation rather than caution, and for a while it made the rumor mill even louder. Part of the problem is structural, not personal. Low-effort content farms and clickbait channels have every incentive to recycle the most dramatic possible headline about a public figure, because outrage and shock generate clicks far more reliably than a boring, accurate explanation does. Once one site publishes a claim, however thinly sourced, a dozen others repost it with a slightly different headline, and search engines start treating the volume of repetition as a kind of credibility, even though every single one of those articles traces back to the same unverified original claim. By the time a rumor about Danny Koker facing prison time had bounced around enough low-quality entertainment sites, it had the surface appearance of being widely reported, even though no reputable outlet had ever actually confirmed it. That's how a real, documented civil lawsuit involving a former employee's misuse of company funds can mutate, within a couple of news cycles, into completely unfounded claims about the show's star being arrested, indicted, or seriously ill. What actually connects the lawsuits to the show's ending isn't scandal. It's fatigue. Between a legal dispute that pulled attention and resources away from the business, a pandemic that made filming logistically difficult, and ratings that had cooled after nearly a decade on air, Counting Cars simply reached a natural stopping point. There was no cover-up. There was just a show that quietly ran its course while the internet insisted on writing a more dramatic ending. While rumors about the show swirled online, Danny's actual day-to-day life kept moving in a much less dramatic direction. He never stepped away from Count's Kustoms. The shop kept taking on restoration and custom work, kept its doors open to the public for tours, and remained a functioning business long after the cameras left. The one major very real change came in the summer of 2025, when Danny and his wife Corey, who had run the venue's talent booking for years, made the decision to close Count's vamped rock bar and grill after 16 years in operation. This wasn't a scandal or a financial collapse. By Danny's own account, it came down to something much simpler: the sheer amount of work it takes to run a live music venue for that long. Operating a rock club means booking bands, managing staff, handling late nights, and doing it all on top of running a full-time custom car shop and staying visible as a public figure. After a decade and a half, that workload had caught up with him, and rather than let the venue slowly decline, he chose to close it on his own terms. The bar didn't fade away quietly, either. Its final stretch of shows featured well-known touring rock acts, and its last night drew a packed house for a farewell performance from Danny's own band. Afterward, the building went up for sale, listed in the millions of dollars, with the Kokers exploring offers from buyers interested in continuing the space as a venue in some form. It was a genuine ending, but it was the kind of ending business owners choose for themselves after years of hard, physical, unglamorous work, not the kind that gets forced on someone by scandal or financial ruin. Predictably, some corners of the internet spun the closure into another sign that Danny was finished, ignoring the fact that closing one business after 16 years of success is not the same thing as disappearing.